Nested Squirrels! Today we're going to read our first story from an author called Saki, S-A-K-I, who lived from 1870 to 1916. So he wasn't very old when he passed, he or she. And this is called, I need to clean my Kindle, Reginald on Christmas Presents, first published in 1901. I wish it to be distinctly understood, in parentheses, said Reginald, that I don't want a George Prince of Wales prayer book as a Christmas present. The fact cannot be too widely known. There ought, in parentheses, he continued, to be technical education classes on the science of present giving. No one seems to have the faintest notion of what anyone else wants, and the prevalent ideas on the subject are not credible to a civilized community. There is, for instance, the female relative in the country who knows a tie is always useful and sends you some spotted horror that you could only wear in secret or in Tottenham Court Road. It might have been useful had she kept it to tie up currant bushes with, when it would have served the double purpose of supporting the branches and frightening away the birds. For it is an admitted fact that the ordinary tomtit of commerce has a sounder aesthetic taste than the average female relative in the country. Then there are aunts. They are always a difficult class to deal with in the matter of presents. The trouble is that one never catches them really young enough. By the time one has educated them to an appreciation of the fact that one does not wear red woolen mittens in the West End, they die, D-I-E, or quarrel with the family, or do something equally inconsiderate. That is why the supply of trained aunts is always so precarious. There is my Aunt Agatha, for example, who sent me a pair of gloves last Christmas, and even got so far as to choose a kind that was being worn and had the correct number of buttons, but they were 9s. I sent them to a boy whom I hated intimately. He didn't wear them, of course, but he could have. That was where the bitterness of death came in. It was nearly as consoling as sending white flowers to his funeral. Oh, no. Of course, I wrote and told my aunt that they were the one thing that had been wanting to make existence blossom like a rose. I'm afraid she thought me frivolous. She comes from the north, where they live in the fear of heaven and the Earl of Durham. Reginald affects an exhaustive knowledge of things political, which furnishes an excellent excuse for not discussing them. All that's in parentheses. Aunts with a dash of foreign extraction in them are the most satisfactory in the way of understanding these things. But if you can't choose your aunt, it's the wisest in the long run to choose the present and send her the bill. Even friends of one's own set, who might be expected to know better, have curious delusions on the subject. I'm not collecting copies of the cheaper editions of Omar Khayyam. I gave the last 4 that I received to the lift boy, and I like to think of him reading them, with Fitzgerald's notes, to his aged mother. Lift boys always have aged mothers. Shows such nice feeling on their part, I think. Personally, I can't see where the difficulty in choosing suitable presents lies. No boy who had brought himself up properly could fail to appreciate one of those decorative bottles of liquors that are so reverently staged in Morrell's window, and it wouldn't in the least matter if one did get duplicates. And there would always be the supreme moment of dreadful uncertainty whether it was creme de menthe or chartreuse, like the expectant thrill on seeing your partner's hand turned up at bridge. People may say what they like about the decay of Christianity. The religious system that produced green chartreuse can never really die. And then, of course, there are liqueur glasses and crystallized fruits and tapestry curtains and heaps of other necessaries of life that make really sensible presents. Not to speak of luxuries such as having one's bills paid or getting something quite sweet in the way of jewelry. Unlike the alleged good woman of the Bible, I'm not above rubies. When found, by the way, she must have been rather a problem at Christmas time. Nothing short of a blank check would have fitted the situation. Perhaps it's as well that she's died out. The great charm about me, in parentheses, concluded Reginald, is that I'm so easily pleased. But I draw the line at, in parentheses, Prince of Wales prayer book. That's all. Since it was so short, I'll read the next one. Reginald's Christmas Revel, published 3 years later, 1904. They say, said Reginald, that there's nothing sadder than victory except defeat. If you've ever stayed with dull people during what is alleged to be the festive season, you can probably revise that saying. I shall never forget putting in a Christmas at the Babwalds. Mrs. Babwald is some relation of my father's, a sort of to be left till called for cousin, and that was considered sufficient reason for my having to accept her invitation at about the 6th time of asking, though why the sins of the father should be visited by the children. You won't find any notepaper in that drawer. That's where I keep old menus and first night programs. Mrs. Babwald wears a rather solemn personality and has never been known to smile, even when saying disagreeable things to her friends or making out the stores list. She takes her pleasures sadly. A state elephant at a durbar gives one a very similar impression. Her husband gardens in all weathers. When a man goes out in the pouring rain to brush caterpillars off rose trees, I generally imagine his life indoors leaves something to be desired. Anyway, it must be very unsettling for the caterpillars. Of course, there were other people there. There was a major somebody who had shot things in Lapland or somewhere of that sort. I forget what they were, but it wasn't for want of reminding. We had them cold with every meal almost, and he was continually giving us details of what they measured from tip to tip, as though he thought we were going to make them warm under things for the winter. I used to listen to him with a rapt attention that I thought rather suited me, and then one day I quite modestly gave the dimensions of an okapi I had shot, and I may be saying that wrong. I've seen it and seen the animal, but can't remember. Okapi. I had shot in the Lincolnshire Fens, Fens. The major turned a beautiful Tyrian scarlet. I remember thinking at the time that I should like my bathroom hung in that color. And I think that at that moment he almost found it in his heart to dislike me. Mrs. Babwald put on a first aid to the injured expression and asked him why he didn't publish a book of his sporting reminiscences. It would be so interesting. She didn't remember until afterwards that he had given her 2 fat volumes on the subject with his portrait, an autograph as a frontispiece, and an appendix on the habits of the Arctic mussel. It was in the evening that we cast aside the cares and distractions of the day and really lived. Cards were thought to be too frivolous and empty a way of passing time, so most of them played what they call a book game. You went out into the hall to get an inspiration, I suppose. Then you came in again with a muffler tied round your neck and looked silly, and the others were supposed to guess that you were Wee McGregor. I held out against the inanity as long as I decently could, but at last, in a lapse of good nature, I consented to masquerade as a book. Only I warned them it would take some time to carry out. They waited for the best part of 40 minutes when I went and played wine glass skittles with the page boy in the pantry. You play it with the champagne cork, you know, and the one who knocks down the most glasses without breaking them wins. I won with 4 unbroken out of 7. I think William suffered from over anxiousness. They were rather mad in the drawing room at my not having come back, and they weren't a bit pacified when I told them afterwards that I was at the end of the passage. I never did like Kipling, was Miss Babwald's comment when the situation dawned upon her. I couldn't see anything clever in Earthworms Out of Tuscany, or Is That by Darwin. Of course, these games are very educational, but personally I prefer bridge. On Christmas evening, we were supposed to be specially festive in the old English fashion. The hall was horribly drafty, but it seemed to be the proper place to revel in, and it was decorated with Japanese fans and Chinese lanterns, which gave it a very old English effect. A young lady with a confidential voice favored us with a long recitation about a little girl who died or did something equally hackneyed. And then the major gave us a graphic account of a struggle he had with a wounded bear. I privately wish that the bears would win sometimes on these occasions. At least they wouldn't go vaporing about it afterwards. Whew. But, let's see, before we had time to recover our spirits, we were indulged with some thought reading by a young man whom one knew instinctively had a good mother and an indifferent tailor. The sort of young man who talks unflaggingly through the thickest soup and smooths his hair dubiously as though he thought it might hit back. The thought reading was rather a success. He announced that the hostess was thinking about poetry, and she admitted that her mind was dwelling on one of Austen's odes, which was near enough. I fancy she had been really wondering whether a scrag end of mutton and some cold plum pudding would do for the kitchen dinner next day. As a crowning dissipation, they all sat down to play progressive Halma, Halma, with milk chocolate for prizes. I've been carefully brought up and don't like to play games of skill for milk chocolate, so I invented a headache and retired from the scene. I had been preceded a few minutes earlier by Miss Langshan Smith, a rather formidable lady who always got up at some uncomfortable hour in the morning, and gave you the impression that she had been in communication with most of the European governments before breakfast. There was a paper pinned on her door with a signed request that she might be called particularly early on the morrow. Such an opportunity does not come twice in a lifetime. I covered up everything except the signature with another notice to the effect that before these words should meet the eye, she would have ended a misspent life, was sorry for the trouble she was giving, and would like a military funeral. A few minutes later, I violently exploded an air-filled paper bag on the landing and gave a stage moan that could have been heard in the cellars. Then I pursued my original intent and went to bed. The noise those people made in forcing open the good lady's door was positively indecorous. She resisted gallantly, but I believe they searched her for bullets for about a quarter of an hour, as if she had been in a historic battlefield. I hate traveling on Boxing Day, but one must occasionally do things that one dislikes. That's it. It's funny, I'll give it that. But that's about 15 minutes almost. So I don't know if you guys like this or not, so maybe I'll go on. Let's see what else we got. Who else do we have? Let's see here. If you like that guy, let me know. There's 2 more stories, probably short. The next one's called Down, D-O-W-N, Pens, P-E-N-S. And the last one's called Birdie's Christmas Eve. They're all short. And then the next author is Walter Scott, and the story's called Christmas in the Olden Time. Oh, it's a poem. I don't mind poems, but they're pretty short. Let's see what the next ones are poems too. Nora Archibald Smith, who has 2 stories, Little Piccola and Neighbors of the Christ Night. Neighbors of the Christ Night is a short poem too. Oh well, I'll look through and see what looks good. If you want me to read those other 2 from Psyche, just let me know. Love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly, and have a good sleep. Bye-bye.